Okay, very good. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's training on recognizing and accommodating tips for supporting individuals with behavioral health conditions. This training will be conducted by Stacia Edmondson, who is the Traumatic Brain Injury Project Coordinator with the Behavioral Health Administration. So we are very excited to offer this again. She has done a number of these sessions for us, and they are always very informative and also a great opportunity to ask questions from someone who is an expert in this field. My name is Chelsea Heyman. I am the Director of Housing Policy at the Maryland Department of Disabilities. Our organization oversees the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing, which is a partnership of our department, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and the Department of Health, and we work on various disability-specific housing programs throughout the state. A bit of housekeeping for today's meeting. I would like for anyone who has a just general chat comment, please put that in the chat. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A, please. That way I can, when I monitor the chat, I can make sure that, any questions are only in the Q&A and the chat is for things like responding to a question that Stacia asks as part of like a general poll for the group, or just to put in comments about technical issues, logistical questions, etc. This session is going to be recorded. It is currently recording, and we will ensure that people get copies of the PowerPoint after this session. So without further ado, take it away, Stacia.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Some of you have already done this, and actually I should have had the slide up earlier, but since there's a large number of folks, just throw your name and where you work and what you do in the chat, and I'll try to take a look at it. But I saw a few people had already done that when they came on, so thank you. This is, as Chelsea said, not the first time we've done a similar presentation. And the last time we did it really focused a lot on COVID-19. I feel like we're all COVID-19'd out at this point. Let's hope COVID's done with us. But because we were sharing resources in earlier iterations of this, in early days, there wasn't a lot. Now there's so much information that I couldn't even begin to give it enough time and justice. So in the chat, I put a link to the Behavioral Health Department of Health webpage on COVID. So there's so much information. There's a lot of stuff there for providers for taking care of our own mental health. And so I direct you toward the MedChi webinar series that was done in conjunction, still going on with the Behavioral Health Administration. They're fabulous. I've attended a few of those myself. So that being said, this is going to be a really quick survey hour. And we're going to talk about signs and symptoms of behavioral health disorders that are common, like depression, substance use, and anxiety. We're going to talk about stigma and other barriers to treatment and supports. Behavioral health considerations for older adults, touch upon that a little bit. Suicide and suicidal ideation, I've really expanded on that part of it because that is such a huge issue. And then just some resources that you can take away with you. So just a reminder, only licensed professionals can diagnose and treat behavioral health disorders. So your social workers and your psychologists and doctors. I'm a rehabilitation counselor, so I am not equipped to diagnose folks. But what I want to know is to give people signs and symptoms so you can make that referral to people who may need that professional help. And one of the ways that I've done that in the past was to teach mental health first aid course. And it's just not been a possible thing for me to do during the pandemic. And so I encourage you, if you have the opportunity to take a mental health first aid course, to do so. But like that, I'm hoping to give people some information that they could use and then some resources to send folks to if necessary. And knowledge is power. We can normalize the experience of behavioral health disorders, be they lifelong or new onset, again, with support and informed resources. And stigma is one of the biggest barriers to getting help. And that's something we are going to talk about today. So just a few fast facts. This is not comprehensive because it's a big topic, but according to the National Institute of Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, nearly 1 in 5 of us live with a mental health condition. Children can experience anxiety and depression. 7.1% of children aged 3 to 17 years, and that's about 4.4 million in this country, have diagnosed anxiety. 3.2% of children aged 3 to 17 years old, and that's about 1.9 million, have diagnosed depression. So our kids are affected just as we are, our adults. So these are common mental health issues that we need to understand so that we can support people, especially minors and children. And then, this month is Brain Injury Awareness Month. So happy Brain Injury Awareness Month to you all. So we do know that nearly 2.9 million people sustain a new traumatic brain injury each year. Tip of the iceberg. We know that it is estimated that 14% of the older adult population has a diagnosable mental illness. And it is estimated that at least half of individuals who are treated for a traumatic brain injury have either alcohol and other substances in their system at the time of injury. So I hope I'm painting the picture that I don't see people and their challenges that they live with, any of us, in silos. So across the lifespan and across conditions, and many co-occur. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I just wanted to be clear in that. So true or false? You put your answer in the chat, and Chelsea's going to give me the feedback. So schizophrenia is the most common behavioral health disorder. True or false? What are folks saying, Chelsea? How quick are you with your fingers?
It looks like we have a bunch of falses coming in.
You are so correct. So the reason why I put this in is because the general public, and though we all are part of the general public, I think those who do not work in behavioral health or are familiar with this topic understand that schizophrenia is very thankfully low prevalence, between 0.25 and 0.64% of the population. But it is one of the top 15 causes of disability worldwide. It emerges in late adolescence, and people do live oftentimes their entire life with managing the symptoms of schizophrenia. However, it is not one of the most common behavioral health disorders. And the reason why I include that is because people oftentimes, due to big news stories, somebody living with schizophrenia who has done something that has harmed another citizen, that is news. Well, we know that people living with chronic mental illness, especially schizophrenia, are more likely to be victims of violence than themselves be perpetrators. But it's what grabs headlines. And that causes stigma. It all kind of relates. The rate of overdose, true or false, from opioids and other drugs has not increased during the COVID-19 pandemic.
We have a bunch of falses coming in right now.
Yeah, you are absolutely correct. So we know that due to this isolation that people are living with, we know that the fentanyl that is in the supply across the board, it's now being mixed in with cocaine and methamphetamines, drugs that people never would think to test because it's just not something that has been done historically. So we just need to get the word out that things are very dangerous for folks who obtain their drugs from perhaps a person that they don't know, or their usual dealer is not available, if they are new out of incarceration, if they relapse and they haven't used in a while. And we know that people are isolated. It's getting better, but earlier in the pandemic, people weren't with others. And so if they overdosed, somebody wasn't there with the naloxone to reverse that overdose. So that is just one other impact of the pandemic. Number 3, depression, anxiety, and alcohol use disorders can co-occur in some individuals. True or false?
Bunch of truths coming in right now.
So right. So depression, anxiety are they're evil twins, right? So the most common mental health disorders, very, very common among all of us, all ages. And then substance use disorders can kind of join the party. And so people are dealing with three things concurrently, which can really put barriers into their engagement with life and meeting their own personal goals. So in Maryland and across the country, true or false, suicide ideation, attempts, and suicide completion are impacting older adults. True or false?
Lots of trues coming in for this one.
Yeah, I made this pretty easy. Yeah. So, older adults, 14% of older adults have a diagnosable mental health disorder, and 4% have a substance use disorder. And our population is aging. We are living longer. That's the good news. But if people are living lifelong with substance use or have in the past, oftentimes retirement, if they've been in recovery for a while, can be a trigger for use again. And also for older adults, we're a little bit more vulnerable to the impact of alcohol and drugs, and so we may progress to having some issues. Maybe not so much when we were younger. Last one: men are more likely to experience an anxiety disorder than women.
Bunch of falses coming in for this one.
Yeah, sorry, ladies. Yep. According to the National Institutes of Mental Health, past year prevalence of any anxiety disorder was higher for females at 23.4% versus males 14.3%. So that's kind of how we roll. So let's talk about stigma and behavioral health disorders. So more than half of people with mental illness don't seek help. About 40% of individuals who know they have an alcohol or drug problem, their families have had the talk with them, they've had some consequences, such as DUIs, or illnesses, or the liver starting to act up on them, and they're not receiving treatment. Why? You just put in the chat, why do you think people are not getting treated for substance use, especially alcohol? Because that's the most common.
Looks like stigma and access to care, not wanting to stop.
Yep.
Money.
Yep.
Misdiagnosed.
Got it. And maybe just don't know where to go for treatment. That's the only one I would add to that list. Excellent. And it's some of it's lack of awareness. So those are the folks that know they have a drug or alcohol problem. But if somebody grew up in a family where alcohol was just very prevalent, it may not be recognized as potentially problematic use, because that's just what we know what we know. Okay. Any other barriers to stigma? I think you all kind of hit most of them, but there is a few others that I want to mention. So we got this, affordable. Okay, so maybe there is treatment, but we can't afford it. There's some cultural factors and attitudes towards behavioral health conditions. Kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So in my family's culture, so the Irish, we don't talk to outsiders about our problems. We tap it down, okay? And maybe we self-medicate to deal. So that's just one indication. But I'm sure those of you whose families have specific attitudes, it's a cultural thing around behavioral health conditions. And if you want to put something in the chat regarding that and share, that is perfectly fine. Low perceived need for treatment by individuals. Again, not my problem. I'm good. Leave me alone. I'm working. I'm fine. Transportation. So public transportation, I live in the greater Baltimore area, and it stinks, basically. And if you're living on the shore, if you're living in Western Maryland, Southern Maryland, it's worse. So sometimes it's hard to get transpo to where you need to go. And there's just not enough mental health professionals. And according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, the United States needs just over 7,000 more behavioral health professionals, mental health professionals to fill the demand. So there's a lot of unmet need out there. And then there's a lack of cultural competence among providers. Some providers aren't sure what the lay of the land is, what the attitudes are for different populations, for different cultures. And so that could be a barrier for people reaching out and getting help because they don't feel they're going to be understood. And all these we could just peel down the onion and really dig in, but in an hour we don't have that luxury. But I imagine you're thinking, given your own experience and maybe the people you've supported over the years, what are some of the issues in terms of cultural barriers to access and using treatment? So I want to talk about stigma a little bit more. I mean, you just cannot make this stuff up. And we wonder why people don't come forth and ask for help. So this is from a 2013 cover story from Reader's Digest, apparently borrowed from a 2012 episode of the Dr. Oz show. Are you normal or nuts? Your core extremes anxieties explained, Reader's Digest. And the second one, killer pilot suffered from depression. You may remember there was a pilot, I believe he was German or Swiss, who crashed his plane into a side of a mountain. And he had been suffering with pretty extreme depression. Killer pilot is not helpful. It's stigmatizing. It makes people question whether they could go that way if their depression, continues. So all these things are not very conducive to an open and honest public discussion about mental health. This next one, demented lady. Yeah, that's not helpful either. Roasted nuts. I mean, this one blew my mind, and it was from a while ago, understood, but you know that this kind of language is still floating out there. A general alarm fire at the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. And this was the front page of the Trenton newspaper in New Jersey. In a press release, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, really took them to task. And the editor did apologize the next day. Thankfully, no residents were injured or killed as a result of the fire, although of the 250 firefighters responded, some did have some heat stress and minor injuries like twisted ankle and some chest pain. So we're going to throw this stuff in the chat as well. Just want to think of some other ways of reframing common language that is unintentionally stigmatizing. So the first example I gave is patient. That to me connotates dependency, lack of personal agency, not able to make decisions for oneself. And in truth, when people are very sick, okay, maybe I'll buy that. You're in the ICU, you are a patient. But as you move people into community services, say in the mental health realm, I prefer the term person. So person-centered language is strengths-based. It's not labeling the person as their disability. So I love your take on some of these other phrases. So frontline staff, how could that be phrased to be a little bit more person-centered? And I'll tell you why I use that as an example in a minute. Does anybody have any other ways of reframing that, of stating frontline staff? You can just throw it in the chat.
Looks like we have somebody saying support. Let's see, support staff, direct care provider.
That's right.
Initial care provider.
Yeah. I've seen coach used, health coach. We used coach in a brain injury program I worked in years ago. So thank you. Yeah, you pretty much hit them all. And the reason why I don't like frontline staff or in the trenches, and these scales fell from my eyes because I was using that language up until maybe 15 years ago. And the reason why it was pointed out to me that we might want to refrain from that is because it kind of sets up a war analogy, right? So this dynamic of us versus them, the enemy has to be overcome. We are the frontline staff, we're armored up. And so if we use the terms that have just been shared, direct professional, support professional, coaching, that's a more neutral term that still conveys the central relationship. Yeah, so thank you. So next one, she's bipolar. How else can we phrase that is not so stigmatizing?
She has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. She has bipolar disorder.
Exactly.
Let's see.
And does anybody put she's living with a bipolar
Looks like
disorder?
those are the two I got so far.
Yeah.
Any other ideas?
The only one that I have is living with a bipolar disorder or a history of. Again, we want to separate people out from their disability because I know people who are living with a bipolar disorder, and that's not the first thing I think of them when I think of my friend. I say, oh, she's bipolar. That's not how we should talk about people. How about manipulative? This one's tough for people. I've been doing this exercise a lot this past month or February, and this one was always stumped people. But can you think of another way of phrasing that?
Challenging behaviors is one I got in. Savvy with their tactics.
Love it.
She wants you to see her way.
Okay. And don't we all want to be heard, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
know what I'm sorry, do you have another one, Chelsea?
Yeah, a person who is strong-willed.
Hey, I like that. Okay. Good self-advocate. What we want to get away from is putting something in the medical record or in the notes that kind of follow people around for the rest of their natural life. People develop reputations among service providers. And if that's written on their notes, like, oh gosh, she's coming our way, and you already have set up some undermining of that potential therapeutic relationship. So we just need to be careful with that language. Now, can people be manipulative? Of course they can. Of course they can, but that shouldn't be the sum total of their personality. And what about this next one, high quad? I have seen that and I have used it, sadly, before I learned better. It's another way of phrasing that.
I don't have any quite yet.
So for those of us who've worked in rehabilitation settings, high quad is shorthand for a person with quadriplegia that's very high up on their neck. High quad. So that's just one more way of referring to somebody as their disability. So they are living with quadriplegia is sufficient. Now the last one, now I did it this morning. I recognized it the minute it came out of my mouth. I said suffering with depression. And the minute it came out, I'm like, Stacia, nope. I should have said living with depression. So does anybody else have any other ways of phrasing that suffering with victim of? I already gave you one.
A diagnosis of dealing with, person with,
Perfect.
experiencing.
Yep. So I just did this with a group of state folk rehab folks, and one of the Chelsea of that training afterwards, she said to me, "Thank you so much for talking about cancer." Because I had no idea, she's a young woman. She is living with a history of a cancer diagnosis. And she said, that is so important. I am not a victim. I am not suffering with. I do not have, a halo over my head because I was diagnosed and survived cancer. So you just never know how language can hit people. And I'll leave that there. But before we go from this slide, I just want to mention another term that's used often, and that is dirty versus clean. Either we're talking about urine or needles. So instead of dirty or clean, which has a connotation of yucky or saintly, sterile as opposed to used needles is one way, and sterile or urine. Because as my mother would say, urine is sterile. She was a nurse. So let's talk about the three different types of stigma, just briefly, because this is, I think, helpful. Public stigma is the negative or discriminatory attitudes that others have about mental illness or substance use disorders. Self-stigma, and that is a huge barrier to getting treatment, is the negative attitudes having internalized shame people with mental illness and or substance use disorders have about their own condition. Why can't I just get myself together? Institutional stigma is systemic, involves policies of government and private organizations that intentionally or unintentionally limit opportunities for people with mental illness and or substance use disorders to get the help they need. For example, funding for somatic versus mental health care. So pretty easy to get your tonsils out, not so easy to have some services for your mental health. It's getting better. There's some more parity in insurance. But systems also can reinforce stigma. And I don't want to go into it, but just recently there's been a big hullabaloo in the public federal level about harm reduction, as just giving, drugs to people, which of course that's not what it is. So smashing stigma, just briefly, and I always bring up who in the public eye has really done us all a favor by being honest and talking about their experiences and really making it kind of safe for other people to share as well. Tracy Morgan's living with a pretty significant traumatic brain injury. Lady Gaga has done so much to smash stigma around depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Jane Pauley has been living with a bipolar disorder for years. These three individuals, despite some pretty huge challenges, are surviving and thriving and in the public eye and using their gifts for all of us. Robert Downey Jr., one of the most incredible actors of his generation, he went through several very public meltdowns related to his substance use disorder, and he is in recovery long term, and he talks about it. Mary J. Blige, depression, alcoholism, and drug use related challenges. There's a documentary about her called My Life. It's on Prime Video if you're interested. And she quietly has been supporting the Mary J. Blige Center for Women and Girls in Yonkers, New York, where she's from. So these are folks who are, living their lives and speaking their truth. And I think that makes it a little bit easier for those who are not in the public eye to recognize there's no shame in recognizing and getting help or seeking help. So, we have thankfully been more upfront across all systems about behavioral health disparities and racial inequities. And so it holds true in the psychiatric and mental health settings. In 2015, among adults with any mental illness, 48% of whites received mental health services compared with 31% of blacks and Hispanics and 22% of people of Asian descent. That's wrong, right? That's a huge, again, something we can unpack and unpeel for hours. But we have to recognize it and then do what we can within our own power and with our own systems to make sure that we're doing the best we can to mitigate that. According to Nora Volko, I probably just butchered her name. She's an incredible, renowned researcher at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She says minorities are less likely to receive buprenorphine, which is a standard treatment for opioid use disorder, than whites. And women with an opioid use disorder are less likely to access treatment than men. So it's gender disparities as well in some of these cases. In a recent presentation, Harvard psychologist Corey Vinslet shared the following regarding racial health equity in substance use disorder treatment. Racial ethnic minorities, Black Americans in particular, suffer disproportionate burden of health and social consequences, despite having a lower or equivalent prevalence of substance use and substance use disorders than whites, with American Indians being the exception. So just think on that for a minute. Again, we can unpack this for hours, but I think it bears reflection. Children, access to post-TBI and access to mental health care. So kids get excellent care no matter where they are. Well, if they have, unless they're in rural areas, let me just say that. But if you're a child in Central Maryland and you've unfortunately had a traumatic brain injury, when you were in the hospital, when you were in rehabilitation services, there is mental health treatment available to you during hospitalization. But once you're discharged, the children, minority children insured by Medicaid, were significantly less likely to receive outpatient mental health services than non-Hispanic white children. And if you heard me talk about brain injury speech, right? Children grow into their brain injuries. So it might have been manageable as children. As they grow, the consequences of those brain injuries as they reach the age where they should be expected to be a little bit more mature and manage their behavior and manage their emotions, say middle school, high school, and beyond, it's not available to them because of that disability from that brain injury. They've grown into it and they're not able to get the treatment that they need, and oftentimes not even recognized connection between that earlier brain injury and their current challenges. So many of us live with untreated and undiagnosed behavioral health disorders, and it's not uncommon for them to be misunderstood or misread. And as I said earlier, sometimes it's just, we all come from different families and backgrounds and cultures. And if you grew up with a parent or a guardian who did not have their depression or anxiety treated, again, it's just how your family rolls. And you may not see anything out of the ordinary. So now we're going to try to guess the mental health challenge here. So quotes from people with lived experience. Perhaps blank can best be described as emotional pain that forces itself upon us against our will, then breaks free of its externals. Blank is not just a lot of pain, but too much pain can compost itself into blank. Grief is blank in proportion to circumstance. Blank is grief out of proportion to circumstance. So any guesses as to what the challenge, what the disability the individual who wrote that is living with? Schizophrenia, anxiety, or depression? 1, 2, or 3?
Depression.
Ooh, you're echoing on me.
Depression. That seems to be
Then you all would be absolutely correct. And that quote is from The Noonday Demon by Andrew Solomon, published in 2015. And it can be a little dry in parts, but Andrew Solomon is somebody with lived experience of serious and severe and persistent depression. Despite that, he's an award-winning writer and journalist. And he talks about folks living with mental illness like himself, as well as other challenges. So highly recommend that book. I learned a lot from it. So yeah, he's describing depression, not only his own experience of it, but the other folks that he talked with in preparing that book and some of the other things that he's published. So what are the signs and symptoms? So signs is what we may notice about somebody else. Angry outbursts, irritable, annoyed about seemingly small things. Now, if you just take those two and you don't think about it in the context of depression, you're like, what a pain in the butt. Who wants to be around him or her? Nothing I say is going to make them happy. They always have some criticism. And you just start to think they're a person with a chip on their shoulder. And, unless you're married to them or they're in your family, you can provide a wide berth, right? And so when that happens to people, and others start to kind of fade away, because who wants to be, the target of that? They become more and more isolated, and the depression just gets reinforced. So again, a lot of this stuff does not look like depression as maybe we think of those commercials, she's on the couch and her dog's not getting walked because she's depressed. Can depression look like that? Sure. But it often looks like irritability and anger that's out of proportion to the situation. And it's sneaking and don't know that's what's going on. More obvious is if somebody's lost weight or gained, they seem distracted, they complain of aches and pains, and this is especially with older adults. So they're going to go to their family doctor. Oh my gosh, I have this headache. Oh, my neck's been bothering me. Oh, my back. And they go through, oh, my chest has been, and a lot of stuff going on. My heart feels like it's racing. And so their doctor runs them through all the tests. Everything's negative. And then they finally get to the mental health issues. And, older adults, the way you grew up in those generations, that's not something we talked about. And so it's very much lives in the body, and that's what they identify. Now, when we get to that last bullet, slowed speaking or body movements, that's vegetative depression. That is severe. That person needs to be seen immediately, needs to be hospitalized more than likely. So that is fortunately not as common as most people's experience with depression, but it's something to be taken very seriously. Symptoms, what the person is feeling: sad, tearful, worthless, woulda, coulda, shoulda, past, present, and future. Failures, real or perceived, are magnified or anticipated. No energy. They can't even choose something off the menu. What movie do you want to see? Oh my gosh, it takes 10 years to identify the movie. Insomnia or oversleeping and not taking pleasure in life's usual delights. And if somebody's experiencing these signs and symptoms for 2 weeks or more, it's really worth making a visit to their physician. Because, as I said earlier, depression is very common. And at least 19.4 million Americans, adults in the U.S., has had at least one major depressive episode. Oh, that's 7.8% of all U.S. adults. It's higher among females than men. And it's something that gets worse if it's not treated. So it's just food for thought. You can't muscle your way out of depression because it can come back to bite you. So here's the next description. I thought forgotten homework would end my entire school career. I lay awake at night, convinced my house would burn down. I thought I was acting weird. I knew I was acting weird. In college, I used the same 2 words as a source text and thought I'd be convicted of plagiarism and kicked out of school. I was worried I'd forgotten something, that I wouldn't finish my work on time, that my boyfriend would die in a fiery car crash whenever he wasn't in my direct line of sight. What are we describing here? Probably guess. Bipolar, generalized anxiety, or schizophrenia.
Looks like there's a lot of number 2.
Yep. Most common, followed by its friend depression. And so these are the signs and symptoms. Others may recognize restlessness. Person is easily startled, doesn't want to try new things. Difficulty making decisions, appears tense. Sweating, appears shaky. Perfectionist, panic attacks can go hand in hand. A lot of feeling of things are going to go out of control. Anxiety can be your superpower. It gets your work done. You schedule those camps months in advance for your kids. But the evil side of it is that it can really take over kind of your mind space, and it's hard to relax. And so the person does feel irritable, worried, keyed up, can't let go, worrying about worrying, catastrophic thinking, it's all going to end terribly. And we also see that people, like folks with depression, may have some somatic issues, the muscle aches, the headaches, tummy troubles. And so it takes a while for some folks to be diagnosed because it can present and feel. You're not making this up. It's felt in the body. So the mind and the body are so well connected. So on to the next one. By that point, my vestal self had grown used to my depressed self with her summer mood and tenuous hold on life. Now a newcomer arrived. I seemed to have split into 3, my shell-shocked self, my depressed self, and a brazen hypomaniac self. We could practically hear the new girl sizing us up, cackling. Under her reign, we slept 2 hours a night. We ate half a sandwich and 2 potato chips a day. We packed the children's lunch boxes at 3 a.m. and we began to study for the medical college admission test. What is this person possibly describing? Bipolar disorder, traumatic brain injury, or substance use disorder? One, yes, bipolar disorder. You would be correct. And there's lots of different types of bipolar disorder. I'm not qualified to dig into those. So what I'm giving you is just kind of the broad view of what it can look like and what it can feel like. So what it may look like is that the person isn't sleeping, or they're not sleeping very much, talkative more than usual, and they're jumping around. It's like, what, nothing's holding together. They also can be acting irritated, especially when you're not receptive to their grand ideas, which you can't make heads or tails out of. Seem very self-involved and have this kind of unearned sense of certainty about their ideas and their actions, and very focused on activities. You can see them really diving into things, school, home, work. I mentioned Jane Pauley. She decided that she was going to design her own clothing line. She's a journalist. It has nothing to do with her skill set, but in her manic state, she was zeroed in on that. Risk-taking behavior with possible adverse consequences. People can do excessive shopping, sexual activities, business ventures, and drugs. So was the person feeling distractible? This kind of like squirrel, that's not the other thing. Hard to really settle in. Very energetic, agitated. Could have some psychosis and delusions. That is one feature of bipolar disorder that's different than most people living with depression. Very, 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 very small segment of folks with severe depression may have some psychosis. It's rare. And then those racing thoughts. So this quote that I gave you was from a person with lived experience, Linda Logan, who talked about her bipolar symptoms. And in truth, it's a relatively low incident mental health condition. 5.7 million Americans, or 2.8 of us, are living with a bipolar disorder. But it does grab headlines. Think of Kanye, I always mangle the man's name, Kanye West. Living very publicly, most likely with untreated bipolar disorder. I think he goes in and out of treatment, and that's not unusual. So when people are living with a bipolar disorder, it's bipolar, so there's two parts to it, depression and the mania, and it feels good to be manic when you've been depressed, and people usually sit in the depression longer and more frequently than they do the mania. And so oftentimes it takes a while to get the right diagnosis, because it appears and presents as depression, because that's when they'll drag themselves to the doctor. Doc, I'm so depressed. And the doctor might not see that manic state. So moving on, you guys are doing great. Keep checking my time here. I am a 17-year survivor. I have many lasting symptoms of blank, but because my parents believed I had a full recovery, I discounted what I felt. I forget the names of my students and coworkers. I cannot call words fluently. Movies and books are no longer enjoyable because I don't remember them. It all came to a devastating blow when I hurt my best friend. We had plans to spend time together. She had to change the plans. The change set me in orbit. I could not handle the change in plans, and I was mean to her because of it. I hurt someone I love. Spontaneity is so hard for me. Change is hard for me. I get mad so easily. I say things I don't mean, and I find myself apologizing often. What is this person describing? Traumatic brain injury, anxiety disorder, or schizophrenia? Number one, that's right, TBI. People can get very rigid. It's hard to be flexible, and it causes relationships to be challenged. So people living with TBI may have issues that you observe, such as following directions. They're disorganized, they're impulsive, say the first thing that comes out of their mind, out of their mouth. They seem to have a weakness on one side. They may limp. Has noticeable scars on their head, face, or neck, wears an eye patch, gets stuck on topics or actions, argumentative. They are so self-involved. They lie, and they're manipulative. All things I've seen in notes, by the way. And what is the person feeling or experiencing? They have a hard time understanding what is said and what is written. They're not able to process. Hard time expressing how they're feeling their ideas. Can't figure out a novel or new situation. Trouble reading nonverbal cues. I mean, somebody could be literally looking at the watch and backing away from them, and they're still talking. right? Not picking up on those nonverbals. Can remember old information like holidays and family members. They struggle with remembering what happened yesterday, even 20 minutes ago. Sees double, which is why they may be wearing the eye patch. Don't understand why old friends aren't in touch. There's fatigue after things they, did before the brain injury, no problem. But going to the Walmart with all those lights and all those people just puts them back, to bed as soon as they get home. And then headaches. So this one, the chronicity of blank is really a fatalism writ large. If an blank knows in his heart he is going to use someday, why not today? But if a thin reed of hope appears, the possibility that it will not always be so, things change. You live another day and get up and do it again. Hope is oxygen to someone who is suffocating on despair. What is this person describing? Anxiety, schizophrenia, or substance use disorder?
Schizophrenia, substance use disorder. A couple people are
No, there's a lot of echo, but it's 3, substance use disorder. It's kind of I don't know, found that quote to be very poetic. It is from David Carr, the late David Carr, who was an incredible journalist, but somebody who was living with a significant and severe addiction to opioids and alcohol and basically anything he could get his hands on. And he wrote a book called Night of the Gun that describes how that substance use disorder impacted his family. And unfortunately, he died of lung cancer, or was it throat cancer, not too long ago. Beautiful writer, beautiful writer. So that's for your reading list. So what are the things that we may see in somebody who is struggling to manage their use of alcohol or other substances? Oh, they can drink their friends out of the table. I mean, when I was in high school, that was a badge of honor. I couldn't do it, but I had friends who could. That means they have a high tolerance for the substance. Family and friends notice the person that isn't as present or available or is preoccupied. What, that wedding's dry? See ya, have fun. Misses days at work, usually Mondays or Fridays, and neglecting typical self-care. And what is that person experiencing? They're preoccupied with obtaining the substance. It takes increasing amounts of the substance to feel normal. And they're kind of irritated when people say to them, gee, I'm kind of worried about, how much you've been drinking lately. And according to the U.S. Surgeon General in 2015, over 27 million of us in the United States reported current use of illicit drugs or misuse of prescription drugs, and over 66 million people, and that's nearly a quarter of the adult and adolescent population, reported binge drinking in the past month. Alcohol and drug misuse and related disorders are major public health challenges, and they do take an enormous toll on families and neighborhoods, drug-related violence and healthcare. It's estimated the economic impact of substance misuse is to 249 billion for alcohol misuse and 193 billion for illicit drug use. So it takes a toll. It certainly does take a toll. So let's ask you a little quiz here. If a woman drinks 4 or more drinks within 2 hours, she is binge drinking, yes or no?
Yeah. A lot of yeses.
You would be so correct. Yeah, that's considered binge drinking. Question 2, are head, neck, esophageal, liver, breast, and colorectal cancers associated with alcohol consumption, yes or no?
Lots of yeses.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. It's the risk goes up with 3.5 or more drinks a day. And for breast cancer, every 10 grams of alcohol per day associated with a 12% risk of breast cancer. And I hate telling you this. I mean, we are just learning this now, the correlation, and in some cases the causation between alcohol use and other health disorders. So how many drinks a day is considered safe level of consumption for women? Any guesses?
2, 1.
1. One is correct, yeah. And I'll give you the one for men. It's 2. But if you are an older adult, and by older adults, and I take no pleasure in this, it's 65 and older who do not take any medications, who are in good health, should have no more than 7 drinks a week, no more than 1 to 2 in any given day. So by the time men reach the age of 65, the safe level for them is the safe level for women. So, and we just need to be careful with drug interaction as we age as well. And as we age, ladies, I hate to say it, but our enzyme in our stomach called dehydrogenase, which helps us break down alcohol, it's not as present in our digestive tract as it was in our younger days. And so that is why you may be like, gee, I didn't drink that much. Why do I feel so kind of yucky today after a certain age? And that is why. So again, hate to be the messenger. So let's talk about suicide. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. It impacts people across the lifespan. Some groups more impacted, by others with higher rates among American Indian, Alaskan Native, and non-Hispanic white populations. And veterans and those who live in rural areas also experience higher rates of suicide completion. So it is something we need to be mindful of. There's a ton of stigma around it, but the good news is it's preventable. So I encourage you to take this number and put it in your phone. It's the crisis hotline. You can also put the crisis text line. You can also call 211, then press 1 to connect with a helpline representative 24/7. That's the Veterans Crisis Line. I have a brother who's a veteran. Let's just say we've called that number a few times for him because he's living with behavioral health issues, and they contact him immediately and assess the situation. And to find crisis services in your state, your county here in the state of Maryland, there's information on the Behavioral Health Administration's crisis service webpage. And again, if somebody is in immediate danger of harming themselves or others, call 911 and ask that a crisis intervention trained, or CIT, officer be dispatched. And they can come to the scene with a mental health provider to really determine what is dealing with that person and what they need to do in order to make them safe. I teach CIT, brain injury classes for jurisdictions all over the state. And those officers understand brain injury is a behavioral health issue, and that brain injury can increase the risk of suicide by at least 2 to 3 times. I take no pleasure in, recognizing that the population that I worked with all these years, we're finally getting the information regarding the risk of suicide, especially among folks with a hidden brain injury. So the more we know, the better we do. So learn the signs and symptoms and be prepared to support somebody. Take that mental health first aid course that I mentioned. Check out the resources at the Suicide Prevention Resource Center in your free time, right? But these are all good things to have at your fingertips. Download the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Suicide Safe app. It's fantastic. It's like a mini mental health first aid action plan for risk of suicide. It's wonderful. You can get it from the SAMHSA store. So I'm going to stop here because we have a few minutes, and I want to ask Chelsea if there's any questions before I provide you with some resources and other little tidbits before we wrap up.
No questions in the Q&A.
You were echoing. So no questions?
No.
Okay, great. So I just gave you bits and pieces of information about the major mental health and substance use related issues. So behavioral health writ large. This is by no means a comprehensive course in an hour, but I hopefully gave you just some things to think about. So when you're interacting with people, you may go, I'm wondering, and then you can make that warm handoff to the appropriate resource. So I find, for myself, as somebody who runs a little anxious, that things like exercise can really help. And as somebody who works in brain injury, I know that we can really make our brains more robust, especially as we age, if we just move. You don't have to run a marathon because God knows I don't. And for people living with significant mental health disorders, such as schizophrenia, also has benefits. We know that people living with chronic mental illness and people living with long-term brain injuries, their mortality, they don't live as long as the rest of us. So people within the public mental health system, I believe their lifespan can be shortened by up to 25 years, and in the brain injury community, 9 years. So anything we can do to promote wellness is a good thing, and it's never too late to get that brain a little bit more robust and resistive to disease, and it just feels good. So here's some resources for you. These are sources actually, but they also could be deemed resources, where I get my information and where I go to check for updates. And that's another one. Our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has really great stuff. Mayo Clinic, very easy to understand breakdown of common behavioral health as well as somatic issues. And National Alliance of Mental Illness, a fabulous resource. They have family education groups. Our Behavioral Health Administration has lots of good stuff on our website. Baltimore Intergroup of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon, fantastic, free, supportive. You can find a meeting anytime, day or night, and just about any time of day or night you can find a virtual meeting. And the Brain Injury Association of Maryland is our NAMI in my community of brain injury. Maryland Access Point, great services, linkage to services for older adults and people living with disabilities. Our Maryland Health Association, what a great group, and they have somebody dedicated to older adult mental health. So definitely check them out. Our Harm Reduction Coalition. I mean, there's so much. It's an embarrassment of riches in this state that we have for folks. And there's some more suicide safe information. And then, if you want to exercise in your living room like I do, if you don't want to go to the gym, there's so much online. So unless there's any questions, I'm going to stop this because then I hope I can look at you. So, and slideshow. I think we're done.
We have a question about the book that you mentioned regarding the book about depression.
Yes, let me get it and show it to the camera. Hang on. So it's called The Noonday Demon, and it's by it's still looking blurry. Andrew Solomon. The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression. So it's Solomon, first name Andrew. It was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. This is the second edition. The 2015 is the second edition. And what he added to the second edition is a chapter on postpartum and actually prepartum depression among women. It's fantastic stuff. He also wrote a book called Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, where he had conversations with families whose children had various disorders and conditions. And actually, he spoke to the parents of one of the Columbine shooters. Just really powerful stuff. He's a beautiful writer. So, yeah, you can just get it off Amazon or borrow it from the library. Anything else? I'm going to move you over so I'm not looking sideways.
I think that's it.
Well, that is wonderful. I really appreciate, everybody's time and attention, especially in your lunch hour. I really appreciate that. The handout, the PowerPoint is available. Chelsea, you can just send that out to the group. And my contact is at the end of that. So if you want to follow up with a question or, anything, if you've got a resource that I'm not aware of, I would love to see it. But anyway, I can't wait till we can see each other in person. I mean, I'm kind of getting used to this but I do miss seeing everybody. So, and thank you for your comments. So Chelsea, you're the hostess with the mostest. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Take care. We're right on time.
Bye.
Bye.